So the next issue that we're going to deal with is Jewish resistance. There were many forms of Jewish resistance, and some are better known than others. We know about spiritual resistance, for example, where people resisted with using religious observance or cultural activities. We know about clandestine newspapers and couriers who resisted by transferring information from one place to another. So I wanted to make the point that there were many forms of resistance besides physical resistance, and an example of that is the partisans. In order to, the Jewish physical resistance started earlier than the native physical resistance in various countries. In order to resist physically, you had to have some knowledge that most Jews didn't have. Most Jews were urban, so the forms of resistance that developed soonest were in cities and towns. They did not involve physical fighting, but they involved evasion and helping people to hide and helping people to get false documents so that they could escape or live on the outside as non-Jews. So safe space in a city or a town was in the city or the town. It was also urban. But partisans who wanted to fight from a clandestine base needed a physical place where they would be hidden. Geography allowed that in forests. Forests in Europe existed in Eastern Europe. Western Europe hardly had any forests, and certainly not the deep, dense forests that would allow for hiding out of sight and camouflaging where you lived from the air so that it would not be visible from the air. Partisans lived in the forests, and they were an Eastern European phenomenon. Jews who made the decision, or Jews or non-Jews, who made the decision to leave their families and communities to go to the forests, that was a very difficult decision for them. First of all, leaving your family meant leaving your parents, who were less capable of sustaining their own lives and needed your help. It could mean leaving your wife or your husband or your children. Those are very difficult decisions to make. Those decisions were made when the family no longer existed, when people had already been killed either in local actions or they had been deported. And so there was little choice, in the same way that we discussed this as happening in urban uprisings, such as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. These were decisions of last resort. So people who went to the forests, and they were generally young people, as you could see from this photograph, they went because they felt that there was very little chance or no chance of their own survival, but they might as well take some Germans down with them and show that Jews could die fighting. Most Jewish resistance groups had some contact with non-Jewish resistance groups. These non-Jewish resistance groups got started a little later than the Jews, but they were more flexible and had more resources than the Jewish resistance groups. And the Jewish partisans in the forests of Eastern Europe were generally connected in some way to the Russian partisans. The Soviet Union had occupied Eastern Poland and Ukraine, and they had an organized army that was well supplied from Moscow. They had airplanes, they had heavy equipment, they had arms, and they often supplied the partisans with airdrops of supplies and arms. In order for Jewish partisans to benefit from this, they had to accept the authority of the Soviet military. And that was usually the case, that Jewish partisans were under the authority of the Soviets, but they weren't totally under that authority. They often operated on their own. What did Jewish partisans do? They did a lot of sabotage. They couldn't confront the German army openly, so they engaged in guerrilla warfare. They blew up trains, they destroyed electric installations. How did they support themselves? Mostly by stealing from the local population, terrorizing the local population into giving them food and other material that they needed for their own survival. Here you see a rather peculiar scene. This is a makeshift medical station, a medical treatment station in the forest. You see two people in white coats. I suspect that they got those white coats for the sake of the photograph. One person standing up, he might be holding a bottle, or maybe he's just leaning on a tree, but his head is already bandaged, and a male in a long white coat and a female in a long white coat are treating a partisan who is sitting up on the stretcher. You see him in an army cap, and you see the top of his body, and it looks like they're taking care of something that's wrong with his legs. Medicine in the forest, as you see, was very makeshift, no sterile conditions. They were lucky if they had water, and lucky if they had some kind of antiseptic powder with which to take care of wounds. The partisans were generally young, and so they were resilient and in good physical condition. They did have food, which they stole from the local population, or they would steal a cow and butcher it. So they were in pretty good physical shape, although their living conditions were beyond primitive. They basically lived in dugouts underground. Here you see an example of medical care or physical or surgery in the forest under very difficult conditions. The partisans had very little military training or experience. Anyone with any military training would immediately become a commanding officer. And the Jews who fought in the forests fought with their determination and their guts, and very little equipment, very few bullets, few rifles. In order to be accepted into a partisan group, you usually needed a weapon. Women were often not given weapons. They had to either have a relationship with a man who would give her a weapon, or they did other things in partisan groups, such as nursing, as you can see here, or they did the cooking or the laundry. The work was divided in partisan groups along gender lines, and the women did what was usually considered women's work. Some women who had weapons were allowed to go on military raids, and when you speak to those survivors, they are very proud of the fact that they had a weapon and they actually fought. The partisans did not win the war. It was the regular army who won the war. But The partisans were the thorn in the side of the German and the Axis armies. They did harass them, they did damage, and they showed the world that it was possible to fight back even against the Nazi army. For Jews, it was a tremendous morale booster for themselves and for others who heard about them, that to show that Jews did not go passively to their own deaths. Another way of resisting was to go into hiding. And there were two ways of hiding. I'm sure that you're all familiar with the Diary of Anne Frank. So the Frank family went into physical hiding. They had set up a hiding place, a physical place in that attic where they stayed throughout the duration of their experience until they were betrayed and discovered by the Germans. Other people managed to stay in hiding throughout the war. Some people had to change their hiding place as many as a dozen or more times during the experience. Hiding in that way required a support system of those who could be on the outside and supply them with food and water and take away waste and generally provide them with some moral and psychological support. Another way of hiding was to hide in plain sight. Hiding in plain sight required you to take on an artificial identity. You had to play charades for 24 hours, 7 days a week. You paid for false identification, and you took on a new identity, a new name, a new background, a new history, and you had to make believe that you were not Jewish, but Christian. So it involved learning Christian culture, learning how to behave in church, learning what to do under circumstances that most Jews would not have encountered. Let's have the next slide. It was easier for women or young girls to hide than for men or boys to hide. I mentioned yesterday that Jewish men were universally circumcised in a world where Christian men were generally not circumcised. So it was easier for a family to put their little girl in hiding with non-Jews, and they would bring her up and treat her as if she was one of their own. And here we see Paulette Filer in her communion dress on her way to church, and marking this as her identity. This was her identity. You couldn't let your guard down, not even for 1 second, not even when you were sleeping, in case you spoke Yiddish in your sleep or said something in your sleep that would betray your identity. Even those who were hiding in plain sight needed some kind of support system. With children, it was easier because the adoptive parents were generally the support system. But with teenagers and adults, they also needed a support system. Sometimes a family would split up and the children would be put into hiding with non-Jews. So they would be hidden physically as Jews, and the adults would go into hiding in plain sight with false identities, and they would check on the children from time to time to make sure that they were still with the adoptive parents, that they were being treated right, and often the adoptive parents had to be paid for the child's support, and to enable the adoptive parents to get ration cards for that child, because everyone in Europe was living off ration cards. And if you didn't exist legally, you couldn't get food. So that was a very important part of the support system to be able to provide food for those who were in hiding. You needed false papers, which had to be purchased. You had to be able to overcome the psychological and emotional isolation of this false identity. Imagine to yourself playing charades 24/7. It's psychologically very, very challenging. And the physical dangers for men who did this were particularly challenging. Another way of escaping, and we mentioned escape as one of the tactics of survival, was another place that you could escape to was Soviet territory. Remember the map that we showed you yesterday, and we saw the vast Soviet territory to the east of Nazi-occupied territory, to the east of Poland and Ukraine, and to the further east of Yugoslavia and the Balkans. At the very beginning of the war, when the war broke out, Germany and the Soviet Union were allies. On June 21st, 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and so they were no longer allies, and the Soviet Union became an enemy of Germany. So Jews, if they could manage to cross borders, could get to the Soviet Union where they were not going to be persecuted because they were Jews. Now, Lawrence Langer calls this a choiceless choice. A choiceless choice is when you have to make a choice between two alternatives, both of which are bad, and for which you do not know the implications of your choice. In June of 1941, the Jews had no way of knowing which would be better, living under the Soviets, which was an atheistic society and religion was not permitted. Religion, Jewish education, Jewish culture, none of that was permitted. Or to stay under German occupation, which some people remembered from World War II was civilized and rather benign, particularly for women and children. And very few people in June of 1941 knew of the possibilities that the Germans would increase their persecution of the Jews to the extent that it would become murderous. At that point, they were just ghettos. And ghetto was something that Jews thought that they could live with. So the choice was really very difficult. Some Jews took that choice and smuggled over the border to the Soviet Union, and they tried to find refuge either in towns or cities. The Soviets were not happy about this influx of Jewish refugees from German-occupied territory. The Soviets wanted to assure themselves that those refugees would become loyal Soviet citizens. Remember, Soviet Union was a dictatorship and it was a totalitarian system. So dissidents were not tolerated. Jews who wanted to maintain a Jewish lifestyle were dissidents, and that was not tolerated. They weren't trusted by the Soviets because they refused to accept Soviet citizenship and the obligations that came with Soviet citizenship. So shortly after, in the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union decided to deport those Jewish refugees from Poland and other countries, to deport them to a place where they could be under control. And they set up huge deportation trains and came and arrested the non-Soviet citizen refugees and took them off to labor camps in Siberia. And you know that Siberia is the paradigm of difficult imprisonment. And there they were kept in prison camps forced labor camps under very difficult conditions of forced labor, usually in mining, where they were underground, in terrible climate conditions where in the wintertime, the men helped each other learn that you couldn't open your pants in order to urinate or your member would freeze. So it's just an example of how difficult the winters were in Siberia. In the summertime, the mosquitoes were just as difficult, and the mosquitoes carried diseases, and there was no air conditioning. They lived in very primitive barracks and huts, sometimes in tents, and they suffered terribly both in the winter and in the summer from the very difficult climate conditions in Siberia, aside from the fact that they were assigned to very difficult forced labor. They were cutting down trees, they were breaking roads through the very thick forests, they were doing coal mining. Even the women were assigned to this same kind of difficult forced labor as the men. So it was very difficult. Conditions changed in the spring of, in June of 1944. When the Soviets allowed Jews to leave Siberia and those northern provinces and find refuge in the eastern provinces, those provinces whose names ended with S-T-A-N, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc., etc. There they were not in forced labor camps, although many were put into collective farms and had to do agricultural work, but that was not nearly as difficult as the forced labor in Siberia. Many others simply were able to find refuge in the cities of the eastern provinces where there were pre-existing Jewish communities, and they were able to survive. Very few of those Jews who went to the eastern province died from any reasons except natural causes. So that was one way of surviving through escape, but it didn't happen immediately. It took a few years until that was a possibility. What happened at Liberation? And what I'm going to tell you is from the perspective of American liberations, because that's those are the sources that we have. No one, not the Americans and not the Russians, was prepared to liberate a concentration camp. Concentration camps were not military targets. The military has instructions, they have manuals for doing everything that you have to do in military life. There's a manual for how to get dressed in the morning, how to tie your shoelaces. If you're a medic, there's a manual and you get training for how to tie a bandage. There was no manual for how to liberate a concentration camp. There were no instructions, there was no policy, and they didn't know that they were going to liberate concentration camps. They didn't know the concentration camps existed because they weren't on most military maps. So they stumbled on the concentration camps, or they heard what one commanding officer of lower rank might have heard from a commanding general that in the area that you're going to approach, he thinks there might be a concentration camp, but he didn't know any more about it than the lower ranking officer. And so they stumbled on it. Let's have the next slide. And when they got there, they found people in this condition, and these are the ones in better condition because they're mobile. They found people lying, dead people lying in heaps, as you can see in the background in front of the window of that barrack. That is a pile of bodies. Mostly they found bodies on the ground. Before they got to the camp, they smelled it. There was a terrible stench of death and decay, a stench that none of them had ever heard in the past. What do you do when you stumble upon something like this? And it wasn't just one place, but it was countless places, and they looked similar, and the military just didn't know about it. So they improvised their response. The first response to the concentration camp it's a natural response by healthy people to people who looked like this. They offered them food, but that was the wrong response, because people who had been emaciated and devastated by hunger couldn't eat the food that the military was offering them. What did they have to offer right away? They had their K rations. Those are high protein and high fat rations. So people died from the food that was being offered to them. They learned from experience not to offer food, but to offer soups and cereals and things that are very much easier to digest. One of the first responses was burial of the dead. There were heaps and piles of the dead, and those had to be buried for hygienic reasons because they were sources of infection. The military, as soon as the camp was liberated, people went out of the camp. They left the camp. And so you had roads filled with people who were escaping from the liberated camp. They wanted to go home. They wanted out. They wanted to find food. They wanted to find decent shelter. And so there was a chaotic situation. The military first concentrated not only on feeding and providing some kind of shelter for people, they concentrated on population control. They didn't want people choking the roads. The military needed those roads in order for them to still function. Camps were liberated before the end of the war. They couldn't have people running around on the roads because they had to get to their next military objective. They concentrated on the physical needs of the survivors: food, clothing, and shelter. These survivors, if they had anything at all, had the tattered remnants of the rags that they were given to wear, and they were infested with lice, which is also a source of infection. They concentrated on burials, and there are films of the British at Bergen-Belsen using bulldozers to dig mass graves and push the piles and piles of bodies into those mass graves. The survivors were not jubilant at liberation. If you look at the facial expressions of these four men, they're very stark. They're without affect. Liberation was not a happy event. Why weren't they happy? They were free. First of all, they weren't quite sure what to think. Were they really free? What did freedom mean for them? It meant that they were not behind barbed wire, or they were not under the Nazis, or they were not in danger of the gas chambers, but it didn't mean that they had any choices. Where should they go? Who was left for them to find? Did they have any families left? Most people had no family left. They were all alone as they were when they first got to the concentration camp. So they hooked up with each other and they tried to go home. They hooked rides on trucks and on trains once the transportation got started. They tried to go home, to search for their family. Usually they found no one, or they found one person. The American Jewish chaplains realized and understood the terrible need that survivors had to find family. And so they facilitated the creation of lists of survivors, which would be posted in cities and in the displaced persons camps that Americans and the British set up for survivors to find each other, to find people from their same hometown, or to find surviving family members if they were very lucky. The lists were posted on the walls of the Jewish community centers and of the recreation halls in the displaced persons camps. And it took months and sometimes years, but sometimes some families did find each other, and a sort of a life began in the displaced persons camps. Why were there displaced persons camps? Because people had no homes to go back to. Why didn't they leave Europe? They wanted to. They couldn't leave Europe because of immigration restrictions in the free world. The United States had immigration restrictions, those same quotas that prevented people from getting to the United States before the war. Those quotas were still in effect after the war. You still needed a sponsor in the United States who would vouch that you had enough assets in order for you to be self-supporting, so the government would not have to support you. Why didn't they go to Palestine? Israel did not exist until May of 1948. So the Palestine was under the British mandate, and the British had imposed, in 1929 and 39, they had imposed immigration restrictions on Jewish immigration. They allowed 1,500 Jews to immigrate to Palestine at the end of the war. 1,500 Jews was nowhere near sufficient to accommodate the 250,000 survivors who were counted in the displaced persons camps. So there was a period of waiting. The displaced persons camps were first under the administration of the American Army or the British Army. The Russians did not set up displaced persons camps. The Russians believed in repatriation, send the survivors back to where they came from. And that's what they did. So survivors who were sent back to their Polish villages and towns by the Russian liberators found that there was the same or worse anti-Semitism in their towns than as what there was at the beginning. So they left Eastern Europe and made their way illegally to the American zone of occupation so they could try to get to the United States or to Palestine. So there were tens of thousands or more Jewish displaced persons in the displaced persons camps. After a while, the need was felt to set up camps only for Jewish survivors because the same anti-Semitism that operated in Europe before the war operated in the displaced persons camps at the beginning when Jews and non-Jews, Jewish displaced persons, were all in the same camp. I know it's a little hard to believe, but that's what happened. And after a report by an American diplomat about the conditions in the camps, it was decided, according to his recommendations, to set up camps only for Jews. And then after that started happening, Jewish camps were administered. There was a self-government within the Jewish displaced persons camps, and they set up schools and they set up cultural activities. They set up synagogues and study halls, and they also, there were Jewish marriages, and Jewish life started up again in the displaced persons camps during this interim period of waiting. The waiting period was sometimes very long. Sometimes it took several years. The last displaced persons camp was closed only in 1952. So we have a period from 1945 to early 1950s when there were thousands and thousands of displaced persons waiting to emigrate someplace. Some Jews who wanted to go to Palestine, either because they were Zionists or because others whom they had bonded with wanted to go to Palestine, or because they had family living in Palestine. There was a Jewish community of more than 600,000 Jews in Palestine at the time. And they were eager to accommodate the displaced persons, the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. And so they sent emissaries, representatives, to the displaced persons camps to organize so-called illegal immigration to Palestine. That effort had a name. In Hebrew, it was called bricha, which means escape. And they organized these illegal transports of adults and young people and children to take them to Palestine, where they would be welcomed and accommodated and helped to be rehabilitated. The British quickly figured out that there were illegal transports going to Palestine, going from Europe to Palestine in boats that were commandeered and purchased and set up by the Bricha organization in order to transport these people. So the British, who patrolled the Mediterranean, would find these illegal boats, and when they got to Palestinian waters, they would board the boats and forcibly transfer the survivors to their own boats and take them to the island of Cyprus, where they were put into camps, and gradually they would be allowed to enter Palestine. The 1,500 quota per month was divided between the displaced persons camps and the detention camps in Cyprus. So 750 came from Europe and 750 came from Cyprus, until the State of Israel was declared in May of 1948, at which point there were no more restrictions on immigration, and immigration increased dramatically. There was a gradual increase in the immigration to the United States because of pressure within the United States to allow additional survivors to come into the United States. Now, being a survivor did not qualify you for immigration. You still had to qualify for immigration. But in 1948, the United States Congress passed what was called the DP Act, allowing for 200,000 displaced persons to enter the United States beyond the quotas. These 200,000 were not limited to Holocaust survivors. It was not limited to Jews. And as a matter of fact, most of the displaced persons who came in at that time were not Jewish. And most of the people who were subsequently prosecuted by those who were looking for Nazi war criminals had come in through the Displaced Persons Act. In 1950, that act was broadened to allow more Jews to enter. The details of the restrictions on these acts are kind of complicated, so I'm skipping that. But you should know that by 1950, it was a little easier for Jewish displaced persons to enter the United States. By then, many had already gone to Palestine. And then what happened was that some left the state of Israel and came to the United States during the 1950s or 60s, when in the 1950s, living conditions in Israel were very, very difficult. because of the influx of so many refugees. And so it was very difficult for them to survive and sustain themselves. So by 1952, most DP camps were closed. So what happened to the survivors when they came either to Palestine or to Israel or to the United States? Before that, let's have the last slide. Okay, here you see a wedding in a displaced persons camp. And it's probably not like the weddings that you're accustomed to seeing. There's the bride and the groom standing under what's called a chuppah, a canopy. That's traditional, the traditional marriage ceremony where the bride and the groom stand under a canopy that symbolizes the house that they're going to build. You see in the front a bearded man in a hat holding a cup of wine. That's probably the rabbi who's conducting the ceremony. Look at the faces of the bride and the groom and the face of the woman standing to the bride's right. Does anybody look happy? When we go to a wedding today, we expect tremendous happiness. The bride and the groom are happy and relaxed, and the other visitors, the guests at the wedding are happy. Nobody looks happy here. Why are they not happy? Because they're all alone. The bride has no family, the groom has no family. It's friends or distant relatives whom they might have found who are standing in for family. And indeed, under the chuppah, during the marriage ceremony, memorial prayers are often said in memory of lost family. Look at the bride's, at what she's wearing. She's wearing a nice white gown, a veil, and something of a mantilla or some lace piece on her head. Where did she get them? There were no bridal stores in the displaced persons camps. She probably borrowed it. And in the displaced persons camps, if there was fabric, then the women sewed wedding dresses. Sometimes they were made out of parachute silk, which was white, and they shared those dresses. Sometimes 6 or 7 or 8 women would wear that dress in one day, sharing the wedding dress so that they could at least dress up as a bride. And the man might have gotten new clothes, or perhaps he also borrowed the new clothes. Same thing with the shoes. They didn't have shoe stores, so if there was one pair of white shoes, all the women shared those shoes. So it was a bittersweet occasion, the marriage. It was sweet because they were starting a new life. It was bitter because their old life was destroyed, and there was no carryover, no remnant of that old life that they could take into their marriage, except for their value system. And that value system continued in the displaced persons camps and in their lives after they got married and after they emigrated to their final destination. That value system, first of all, valued family. And so there was a baby boom in the displaced persons camps where babies were born. It was one of the highest birth rates in the Western world at the time, the displaced persons camps, and similarly in the detention camps in Cyprus. It was very important when they got to their destination for them to be able to support themselves. So they went to work. They didn't say, look what I suffered, the world owes me something. They just rolled up their sleeves and went to work. And they did work that they were not trained for. Many people who had training in professions, or who were writers and journalists and people in the cultural part of society, their background and training was irrelevant in the places to which they went. And so they did any job, even menial jobs, sweeping floors in factories, mining, physical labor, in order to sustain their families, men and women both. So they sustained their families, and they saw to it that their children were educated. Because after family, the most important value for these Jews was education. And the children of survivors are a particularly well-educated generation. And they were also very motivated to contribute to society. Although there were charitable organizations in the Jewish community that helped to support the survivors when they came, most survivors quickly were able to support themselves and no longer needed those charity contributions. So they went to work and they raised their families, and they became contributing members of society wherever they went. And their children became very active in the helping professions, in education, in social work, in medicine. They all became active in philanthropy, because supporting the larger Jewish community was another value that they brought with them. And finally, the value of commemoration. They were determined not to forget what had happened. They were determined to teach the world and to see to it that the world does not forget. And this course that you're taking, and the Museum of Jewish Heritage and other sites of Holocaust commemoration, are an expression of that, established partially by Holocaust survivors and others who were committed to the idea of memory and commemoration. That is why you are taking this course now, and that is why you are teaching the Holocaust, because the survivors have convinced society that the Holocaust must not be forgotten, and that it must be remembered, and the lessons of the Holocaust must be acted upon into the future, so that future generations will understand and make sure that it does not happen again. So I thank you for being part of this effort to educate the coming generations, and for educating yourselves so that you should be successful in your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. So at this time, we have some time for questions. We do have a few that came in already that we'll start with, and then if anyone else has more questions, please feel welcome to message them to me. So Bonnie, one of the questions that we got was if there are statistics on the number of Jewish versus non-Jewish partisans, and if any of the groups work together.
I don't think there are any statistics. I don't know if there are any statistics for Jewish partisans, and certainly not for non-Jewish partisans. But yes, they did work together. It was almost impossible for a Jewish partisan group to work without any contact with non-Jewish groups. That's where they were given, the Soviets did airdrops of ammunition and medical supplies for them, and they worked together with them, even if they had to be under their authority and follow orders and do raids and sabotage according to their orders, but they definitely worked together. In Western Europe, where there were many types of resistance groups, the Jews often worked together with the local resistance groups.
Okay, thank you. Another question that came in was if it's true that the US knew about concentration camps and death camps, but didn't do anything to stop them.
Yes, it is true. Unfortunately, it is true. Information about the mass murder came to the United States in the summer of 1944. The Jewish community organized and demanded that the Americans, that the Allies bomb the railroad tracks leading to Auschwitz. They had a documented, very detailed report about mass murder in Auschwitz with statistics. And this was while the Hungarian Jews, which was the last remaining Jewish community, while the Hungarian Jews were being deported to Auschwitz, the State Department sat on that report for months and convinced Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was the head of the Jewish community in the United States, not to say anything because they said they were checking it out. After several months, the Orthodox Jewish community went on its own and demonstrated and publicized. There was a lot of information available by the fall of 1944. The State Department made a decision not to bomb the railroad tracks, not to provide any assistance to resistance groups. The State Department simply refused. They said it was not a military target. The President Roosevelt, said, we will win the war and then the Jewish people will be liberated.
Thank you. There's also a question about the location of DP camps. Why were they in the countries that they were in? And if there's any statistics about how many DPs eventually ended up in the US.
There's several questions there. The DP camps were located mostly in the American zone of occupation, mostly because that's where the Americans set them up. The British set up very few displaced persons camps, mostly at Bergen-Belsen and maybe one or two others. The Russians did not set up displaced persons camps, and the French had one which was very short-lived and people transferred to the American zone. We know that there were 250,000 survivors in DP camps. We do not have a number for how many non-Jewish DPs there were. We know what the DP Acts allowed, how many displaced persons people were allowed to enter the United States under the DP Acts. I don't have the statistics for how many survivors eventually ended up in the United States. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum might have more detailed statistics, and I believe that they have a number for how many survivors might still be alive at this point, but I don't have those numbers.
Thank you. There's also a question about if you know of any sources that talk about liberation from either the Soviet perspective or the British perspective.
There are books about the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. There's a book by Rabbi Hardman, Hardman, Leslie Hardman, who was the first British Jewish chaplain to get to Bergen-Belsen. But there is other literature about Bergen-Belsen. I am not an expert on the Russian literature, so I can't speak to that. I know that there are sources that are being created now in Russia. There are research centers in Russia that are being created. What did I miss one of the questions?
If there are any, no, just that if there were any sources you knew of from Soviet or British perspective on liberation, which I think you just answered.
No.
Okay. So another question that came in, and this is probably a pretty complicated one to answer quickly, but someone is asking about Pope Pius and if anything was done to aid Jews before or during the Holocaust.
Okay. Pius and other Jewish social service organizations were organized for the purpose of helping refugees come to the United States. And Pius is a long-standing.
Oh, sorry, not. It's not about Pius. It's about the Pope Pius. If he.
Oh, Pope
if
Pius.
The Catholic. Yes, if the Catholic
Okay.
Church did anything, or if the Pope did anything.
Okay, those are two different questions, and the answers are quite different. The Pope's priority was the integrity and the dominion of the church. And the Pope was not going to do anything that would damage the integrity or the power of the church. So if criticizing Nazi Germany was going to endanger the church's functioning in Germany or in Nazi-occupied territory, the Pope was not going to do it, because his first priority was the safety of the church. However, on another level, priests and nuns and bishops and archbishops all over Europe were indeed very helpful to Jews by sheltering them and by providing false baptismal certificates and other church documentation in order for Jews to hide their Jewish identity. In places such as Athens, the head of the Jewish community went to the archbishop, and the archbishop instructed his the lower level church officials to give out false papers, false baptismal papers. And in other places, in France and in Italy, the church officials, not all, but some church officials were very helpful to the Jewish resistance and to sheltering Jews. Sometimes it came at a price, and that price was conversion, or at least educating the children to convince them to become Catholic. So there were mixed motives there. There were humanitarian motives, and there were motives of the church self-interest. Many Jewish children were baptized. At the end of the war, there was a tremendous effort to redeem those children, to get them back, to bring them back to Judaism. Some were successful, some were not. We will never know how many Jewish children were lost because they were sheltered by the church and baptized. So it's a mixed message. The Vatican archives were the part of the Vatican archives were opened some years ago. Another part was more recently opened, and as researchers get access to this material, they will learn more about the internal operations of the church and church politics and the Pope's role in that. One author who has written several books about that is Susan Zuccotti, Zuccotti, and I strongly recommend her books.
Thank you. And I'm putting, I'll send her name in an email to everyone, so in case you didn't get that spelling, you have it. Okay, there's another question asking if there are any sources you recommend specifically about the partisans and their experiences.
Nechama Tech, TEC, wrote a book called Defiance, which is a case study of the largest Jewish partisan group, called by the name of its commander, the Belsky Group. I'm sure Amanda can put that in an email as well. There's another book which is old but still very, very good, called They Fought Back, and it's by Yuri, Y-U-R-I, Suhl, S-U-H-L. And that has chapters not only about partisans, but about Jewish resistance all over Europe in various forms. And if you Google Jewish partisans, I'm sure that you'll come up with several books. There are many books by now about Jewish partisans. Oh, there's a wonderful book for middle school about a little boy. The book is on his name. It's called Mottele, M-O-T-T-E-L-E. I've forgotten the author, but Amanda will find it. And that's a wonderful book to give to middle schoolers about a partisan boy.
Thank you. Yes, so we will send those. We also, we're going to be talking about resistance more tomorrow. And so we'll talk more about resources then for students, as well as share bibliography that we have about resources for teaching about resistance specifically. And I just want to mention to teachers, there's an organization called JPEF, J-P-E-F, Jewish Partisan Educational Foundation, that specifically has classroom resources for teaching about the experiences of partisans. And they have, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, they have wonderful short videos, 10 to 15-minute videos about specific aspects of partisan life, which are just excellent to show in the classroom.
Yeah, they have really great resources for teaching about that specifically. So we will also, I'll send the link to their website in case anyone is interested in seeing what resources they might have. Let me take a look and see what other questions came in while we were chatting. Some of these we answered. So this is another statistics question, so we might not have the answer, but do we know about how many survivors decided to marry other survivors? And are there any statistics on if some survivors were decided to marry outside of the Jewish faith because of the loss of Jewish life?
I don't have statistics, but from dealing with survivors for several decades, I can say with confidence that more survivors married other survivors than not. And it's simply because of shared background, shared values, and shared craziness, shared trauma. Let's put a better word on it. They understand each other. And a similar phenomenon happens with survivors and the lack of extended family. So they adopt each other as extended families, and survivors, certainly as they age and retire and move to retirement communities, they move to retirement communities that have other survivors. In their younger years, they spent summers in bungalow colonies with other survivors and their families. There's a comfort level with interacting with other survivors. In my experience, very, very few survivors married out of the Jewish faith. No matter how negligent they are about Jewish religious observance, There is a core identity that is very strong, that they know they're Jewish, they will not give up that Jewish identity, and they have a stake in the future of Jewish identity. So they married Jews and they encouraged their children to marry Jews. Very few lost their Jewish identity. There's a difference between Jewish faith and Jewish identity. Even those who will tell you that they no longer believe in God and have no Jewish observance did not lose a Jewish identity, and they hold on to that.
Thank you. And I can speak from my own experience as the grandchild of Holocaust survivors that, you know, a lot of what Bonnie just mentioned is definitely true for my family. My grandparents are both survivors, married to each other, got married very quickly after the war. Despite their experiences, they raised my aunt and my father as Jewish. My aunt and my father both married within the Jewish community, despite our not very high levels of observance. And my father often speaks about how growing up, his family, because his biological family was largely murdered during the Holocaust, his extended family were his parents' circle of friends of other Holocaust survivors. So that is a very common experience in survivor families. Trying to see if there's anything else that we didn't address. I think that is pretty much it. So I want to thank you, Bonnie, for joining us, for braving the new world of Zoom to be here. We really appreciate it. And if any other questions come in after Bonnie's lecture, you can always email them to me, and I'm happy to forward them on to Bonnie, who is always happy to answer your questions. So if you think of anything after this, please send me an email.